PAX Chapter 2. So there were lots of them. Peter heard how stupid it sounded, but he couldn't help repeating it. Lots. He plowed his fingers through the heap of plastic soldiers in the battered cookie tin, identical each except for their poses, standing, kneeling, and prone, all with rifles pressed hard to their olive-green cheeks. I always thought he just had the one. No, I was always stepping on them. He must have had hundreds, a whole army of them. The grandfather laughed at his own accidental joke, but Peter didn't. He turned his head and looked intently out the window, as if he had caught sight of something in the darkening backyard. He raised a hand to draw his knuckles up to his jawline exactly the way his father rasped his beard stubble, and wiped at the tears that had brimmed. What kind of a baby cried about something like this? And why was he crying at all anyway? He was 12, and he hadn't cried for years, not even when he'd fractured his thumb bare-handing Josh Groman's pop-fly. That hurt a lot, and he'd only cursed through the pain, waiting with the coach for x-rays. Man up! But today, twice. Peter lifted a soldier from the tin and drifted back to the day he'd found one just like it in his father's desk. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up. Peter's father reached over and had taken it, his face softening. Been a long time. This was my favorite toy when I was a kid. Can I have it?" His father had tossed the soldier back. "Sure." Peter had set up on the windowsill beside his bed, pointing the little plastic rifle out in a satisfying show of defense. But within an hour, Pax had swiped it, which made Peter laugh. Just like him, Pax had to have it. Peter dropped the toy back into the tin, and it was about to snap the lid back when he noticed the edge of the yellow photo sticking up from the mold of soldiers. He tugged it free. His dad, at maybe 10 or 11, with one arm dragged down a dog, looked like part collie, part 100 other things. Looked like a good dog. The kind you would have to tell your own son about. "I never knew Dad had a dog," he said, passing the photo to his grandfather. "That's Duke, dumbest creature ever born, always underfoot." The old man looked more closely at the picture, and then over at Peter, as if seeing something for the first time. "You've got the same black hair as your dad." He rubbed at the fringe of gray fuzz banding on top of his own head. "I had it too, way back. And look, he was scrawny then too, same as you, same as me, with those ears like a jug. The men in our family, I guess our apples don't fall far from the tree, eh?" "No, sir," Peter forced a small smile, but it didn't hold up underfoot. That was the word Peter's father had used. "He can't have that fox underfoot. He doesn't move as fast as he used to. You stay out of that way too. He's not used to having a kid around. You know, war came, and I went and I served like my father. Like your father now. Duty calls, and we answer in this family. No, sir, our apples don't fall far from the tree." He handed back the photo. "Your father and that dog, they were inseparable. I'd almost forgotten." Peter put the photo back in the tin and pressed the lid down tight, then slid it under the bed where he'd found it, and looked out the window again. He couldn't risk talking about pets right now. He didn't want to hear about duty, and he sure didn't want to hear any more about apples and the trees that were stuck underneath. "What time does school start here?" he asked, not turning around. 8. "They said to show up early. Introduce yourself to the homeroom teacher, Mrs. Mirez or Ramirez, something. I got you some supplies." The old man nodded over a spiral notebook and a beat-up thermos and a bunch of stubby pencils bundled up together with a thick rubber band. Peter walked over to the desk and put everything into his backpack. "Thanks. Bus or walk?" "Walk. Your father went to school, and he walked. Follow us to the end, turn right on School Street, and you'll see big brick building, School Street. Get it? You leave by 7:30, you'll have plenty of time." Peter nodded. He wanted to be left alone. "Okay, I'm all set. I guess I'll go to bed." "Good," his grandfather replied, not bothering to hide the relief in his words. He left, closing the door behind him firmly as if to say, You can have this room, but the rest of the house is mine." Peter stood by the door and listened to him walk away. After a minute, he heard the sound of dishes clattering in the sink. He pictured his grandfather in the cramped kitchen where they'd eaten dinner in silence, of the stew, the kitchen that reeked so strongly of fried onions that Peter figured the smell would outlive his grandfather. After 100 years of scrubbing by a dozen different families, this house would probably still smell bitter. Peter heard his grandfather shuffle back along the hall to his bedroom, and then the low spark of the television caught. The volume turned down, an agitated news commentator barely audible. Only then did he toe off his sneakers and lie down on the narrow bed. 6 months, maybe more, of living here with his grandfather, who always seemed to be on the verge of blowing up. "What's he always so mad about anyways?" Peter asked his father once, years ago. "Everything. Life," his father had answered. "He got worse after your grandmother died." After his own mother had died, Peter had watched his father anxiously. At first, there had been a frightening silence, but gradually his face had hardened into a permanent threat of a scowl, and his hands clenched in fists by his sides, as if itching for something to set him off. Peter learned to avoid being that something, learned to stay out of his way. The smell of stale grease and onions crawled all over him, seeping in from the walls, from the bed itself. He opened the window beside him. The April breeze that blew in was chilly. Pax had never been alone outside, except in his pen. Peter tried to extinguish the last sight he'd had of his fox. He probably hadn't followed their car for long, but the image of him flopping down on the gravel shoulder, confused, was worse. Peter's anxiety began to stir. All day, the whole ride here, Peter had sensed it coiling. It always seemed like a snake to him, his anxiety, waiting just out of sight, ready to slither up his spine, hissing in a familiar taunt. "You aren't where you should be. Something bad's going to happen because you aren't where you should be." He rolled over and pulled the cookie tin out from under the bed. He fished out the photo of his father with one arm slung so casually around the black and white dog, as if he never worried he would lose him. Inseparable. He hadn't missed a note of pride that entered his grandfather's voice as he had said that. Of course he'd been proud. He'd raised a son who knew about loyalty and responsibility. He knew that a kid and his pet should be inseparable. Suddenly the word itself seemed an accusation. He and Pax, what were they then? Separable? They weren't, though. Sometimes, in fact, Peter had the strange sensation that he and Pax merged. The first time it happened had been the first time he'd taken Pax outdoors. The kit had seen a bird and had strained against the leash, trembling as though electrified, and Peter had seen the bird through Pax's eyes. The miraculous lightning flight, the impossible freedom and speed. He'd felt his own skin thrill in full body shivers, and his own shoulders burn, as though he was yearning for wings. It had happened again this afternoon. He had felt the car spin away, as though he were the one being left. His heart had quickened with panic. Tears stung again, and Peter palmed them with frustrated swipes. His father had said it was the right thing to do. War is coming. It means sacrifice for everybody. I have to serve. It's my duty. And you have to go away. Of course, he'd have been expecting it. 2 of his friends' families had already packed up and left when the evacuation rumors had begun. What he hadn't expected was the rest, the worst part. And the fox, well, it's time to send him back into the wild anyway. A coyote howled.